I'm Shirley Walker, born a composer. um, all my life, I've made up music to go along with imagined stories. And finding myself involved in film scoring, writing for television is just the ultimate for me. The main title, I think, was an opportunity for me to indulge in a real classic bit of film scoring with just imagery that is haunting, has subliminal meaning that you don't understand until you've been through the experience of the film. It's all setting you up for the movie. Music that needed to do the same thing, that had to say, we're going to take you on a ride. It's going to be scary. There's going to be some evil things involved. My involvement in this film is a result of having worked with Glenn Morgan and Jim Wong on the Space Above and Beyond series. I think one of the things that I like about working with Glenn and Jim in a horror genre is that their tastes are very classical in that they like to have the music carrying the emotion of the film. They like some of the more modern orchestral techniques that where the orchestra's sounding like barnyard animals and stuff. I mean, we're all using those things these days, but they still want to have tunes. They want to have a dark melody where there's a dark thought. They want to have hopeful music and harmonies and stuff where the characters are going through trying to reach out for something that brings hope into their lives. It's exciting to get to work with a director like Jim Wong, who's a real craftsman. And he and Jim Koblenz, the film editor, together just really made this film work without music before they put any music on it. That's a dying art. I think many editors pick a music that speaks to them and then will edit a sequence to that music. And then, boy, you're just stuck. That's all that's going to work there. This whole opening is a wonderfully excruciating big tease. As the high school students get into the airport on their way to France, the music just weaves in and out, quite mysterious. It's just giving a mysterious tone to incidental things that are happening. It all builds up to the premonition of the main character that this plane's going to crash. So the music that I do with Jim and Glenn, I don't think is terribly subtle, and that's fun. Something like this moment where he looks at the plane and sees his reflection on it, and it's this huge, almost monstrous shape. The music is doing the classic scary. Oh, watch out! This is going to have an important part in your life. The first thing I always rely on is my own emotional reaction to a film. That's what I protect. The director communicates very strongly their desires about the music. We go through reel by reel, scene by scene, and we talk about all the things. Where's the music going to be? What is its intention? Whose point of view is it playing? How high do we want the anxiety level to be for the audience at this point in this reel of the film? So all that stuff is kind of mapped out ahead of time. I have a complete book of breakdowns of every bit of the film on paper that shows me the timings for every cut, every line of dialogue, any kind of significant action within a shot, like if it's a close-up of somebody, then when they break into a smile, I have a timing for that. I'm working on themes and broad musical concepts which I present to the filmmakers. And we go through that, coming together in terms of subjective taste. I like a high sound here, I like a low sound for this character. And that's kind of the raw material that we create together. At this point in the movie, he knows something's wrong. And of course, we wanted to tell the audience the same thing. Creating the cues becomes the more sort of the completion of the process. It's taking that raw material of the thematic ideas and feelings and then getting them to fit a scene in a particular way so that right at the right moment you have a little heart palpitation or whatever, whatever we're trying to get to happen in support of the audience watching a film. You want to keep upping the ante in increments that get you right to that peak at the right time. You don't want to be too big too soon. You don't want to give away too much too soon. And that's the tricky part in this kind of a prolonged opening where it's basically the theme from the main title. There hasn't been any new musical material introduced, and it's just restated and evolved slightly and restated, and then the orchestration might get heavier and darker. Percussive elements might come in. Tempo starts increasing a little to, get the anxiety level going a little bit more. Once the plane begins taxiing to the runway, Alex knows, oh my gosh, I just know something terrible is going to happen. And the music has to reflect his increased anxiety. So the cue at that point is definitely from his point of view. Now we've turned on the audience and the music has become one with this character. My tools there are the tempo keeps increasing as the cue goes along. The dynamics get more forceful. The cue that follows while the airplane is blowing up, in essence, is the type of music that it has to be there, but you're really not going to hear that much of it because sound effects are what will bring reality to this moment for the audience. And then we have the recurring death theme, Death March, which is first introduced in the main title, comes back. At this point, it's death saying, oh, yeah, you got away, but I'm going to get you, kid. That theme is the theme from the main title, and that's the one I really spent the most time with in this film. It needed to capture all of the qualities of this force of death that is a trickster, really. In this film, this death presence becomes a trickster with a very mean-spirited sense of humor. So to capture that quality musically was really what I wanted to do. And the low strings were the perfect choice for that, I felt. I think by the time you're halfway through the movie and you hear those violas going dee da da dee, oh gosh, I think it actually builds up on you, just like the choice of the Denver Rocky Mountain High becomes a signal for now it's going to happen. The two went hand in hand; they were musical accomplices. Actually, the choice of the Rocky Mountain High, I think Glenn Morgan, our producer, this is going to become a signature of his work. He loves to find a piece like that, just from another era, actually, and then have it take on a completely independent meaning from what it might have had in its original incarnation as an artist's expression about something. One of the things that fascinates me endlessly about writing a score is that at a certain point in the writing of a score, it kind of starts speaking to you. It tells you what you need to do next. I've heard screenwriters talk about that too, or people who write books, that the characters come to life in a way where all of a sudden there's something that makes sense to you that, yes, this is right, this is what would happen next. And the music kind of works that way too. It's just a complete surprise when it just takes on that life of its own, and you just have that assurance that, oh yeah, we need something sad here, or this should be scary, or it should be scary, but let's fake them out. Let's not put it scary, and then we'll surprise them. And frequently, those decisions are not made by the composer. They're made by the composer and the director, or whomever else might be involved. It depends on what your relationship is with the filmmakers. Once the plane explodes and the students and teacher who got off the plane realize what's happened, the cue that follows that moment is just that expression of, oh my gosh, look what's just happened to our friends. It's unbelievable. And it carries that minor tone and that emotion. By the time we're on the scoring stage where the money's being spent to really record the music, we're not still trying to write the score. At that time, by that point in time, we're actually working on getting a performance from the orchestra. And that's a dream to me. I always like to get it to work that way. Sometimes you have a director who is so skittish and they can't tell themselves whether they like what they're hearing or not. And that's very demanding. I've seen that with a lot of the bigger film composers that I had the pleasure of conducting and orchestrating for. That was the torture of their experience many times, was having a director who just, he'd come in, you'd record a full day, he'd like everything, you'd start the next morning and he'd say, could I hear the playback of this cue? And he'd say, did I like that? And you go, oh my gosh, we're in trouble now. I have a lot of fondness for the low-budget world of the 80s because it's different than the low-budget world of the 2000s. Frequently in those situations, you're given a lot more autonomy creatively. You kind of get to do what you want to do because they know they aren't paying you enough. They're ending up with some music for their film, and you're getting to do what you think you'd like to try to do. Once you get into the mid and upper level of film product, frequently editors and directors are creating the score before you're even on the film. It's been previewed with a temp score that they then feel, well, we really just don't want you to mess it up. We have a moment when all the families come rushing in. And this is a pretty universal experience for anyone who in their own personal life has had this kind of tragedy, where you reach out to your loved ones and you just have that overwhelming sense of sorrow and grief. We wanted to be real respectful of that and not play with it. So the music in that scene is very serious and very much in tune with that feeling, which is a basic human emotion. I didn't want to be disrespectful of that. And then Jim and Glenn, in their playful way, of course, we don't stay there for very long. We have two pieces of music in a row where we're sad. We see the sorrow of Alex and his parents trying to comfort him and console him, while at the same time they're glad that he wasn't killed. Then we have a moment when Mom and Dad are sleeping. He still can't sleep. He's watching the news. And we have another cue that is very, very heartfelt and emotional in support of his feeling for his lost friends. But we don't get to stay there very long. All of a sudden, the terror begins right at the end of that. At the end of the second heartfelt cue, Alex hears something. And he can't tell if it's in the house or it's outdoors. And the music immediately changes. It shifts immediately into suspense. And then there's an increasing flurry of violins and odd, scary, jittery sounds in the orchestra as he's looking around the dark house. He looks out into the street, and then there's a sign as if from the heavens where this big lightning bolt comes down and strikes the street outside his house. So he knows, oh boy, it's the horrible things aren't over yet. The guitar piece at the funeral service that the school and the community hold for the students and the teachers is just intended to be pretty much something that you would have in a community like this. You know, you see the person performing it there. And frequently, the lyrics have a personal meaning for Glenn or Jim. You know, they're real into that, making sure that there's something in the lyric that is addressing what they're saying at any point in time. This score was recorded in 2 days. Normally, a film score of this type and nature, you're going to spend 5 days recording. It was just fabulous to go in there, and Jim and Glenn were behind the score. They knew what it was. They knew that they were trying to protect their budget, so they were very disciplined about not wanting to just use the scoring sessions as an opportunity to experiment with something that we hadn't even talked about doing, which sometimes will happen. I just found it wonderful. We just really concentrated on the performance of the music the whole time. There were a few moments when Jim had concerns about something, and he would tell Tom Milano, the music editor. Tom would come out and let me know, and we'd put our heads together and figure out how to fix it, and then bink, off we'd go, get it done. I conducted this myself. I pretty much have conducted all of my own film scores. During the time that I conducted for other composers, my role was you have 2 directions you have to service. In one respect, you're at the service of the composer and his team of orchestrators and the film. The other role that you're serving is to support the musicians in their ability to perform that music. And sometimes this means that you have to tell a composer, look, the way this is written, we can only do 2 more takes of this. Because, frankly, a lot of composers are not trained in orchestra and instruments, and they may not have orchestrators who are willing to go to them and say, well, you know, you've written this so high on the trumpet, there's like maybe one person on the planet that could even play it. And maybe he won't be able to get it, you know. And then they show up on a scoring stage with this, you know. So I always felt it was important for me to treat the players with the respect they're due and say to the writing team, we can do this so many times, and then after that we may not be able to get it anymore because of the demands of what you've written. I don't know that happens a lot anymore. I had one experience on a Disney film where executives had come in to look at playbacks of the score. The orchestra was on the clock, and so the music people at the studio were very concerned that they were paying these musicians that were going to be forced to sit around for 45 minutes and not be able to do any recording because they were playing back music in the control room. So their request to me was that I rehearse the orchestra on the music that we hadn't recorded yet while they were in there watching playbacks. I knew the scoring stage. I knew they were all sitting down in there and they could not see the orchestra. But because the podium is elevated, all they could see was my back. So I told the orchestra, and of course all the microphones were shut down in the room now because they're playing back in there. So I explained to the orchestra that this was happening. And I said, it doesn't make any sense for us to be rehearsing music that we know is going to be changed. And I don't want to wear you out because we do have a long day ahead of us. So I'm going to just stand up here and I will move my arms as if I am conducting. And I began doing so. And so as I'm talking to the orchestra and telling them this is going on, I'm dutifully moving my arms in these beautiful motions as if we're giving this most moving rehearsal that, boy, they wish they could hear it in there, but they're stuck watching these playbacks. And so I did that, and I would stop and then move the pages of my score and take out my pencil and turn to the violins and tell them a joke as if I was telling them what to play in bar 23 or to change a bowing or something. Sometimes you have to do those things because it just, you know, it doesn't make sense to beat an orchestra to death because they're being paid and just the process of the filmmaking has gotten congested at some point, which is where executives needed to come down and make sure they were okay with what was happening on the scoring stage. I I got involved in playing in hotel bands when I was a teenager, and the guy from the union showed up with his cigar and said, "Hey, kid, if you're going to work here, you're going to be in the union." I worked as an orchestra pianist for many years with the Oakland Symphony. I had played as a soloist with the San Francisco Symphony by winning a concerto competition in high school, and all that broad musical background, playing piano bars, all folded into the film experience in the most wonderful way. My earliest theatrical film experience was with American Zoetrope, Francis Coppola's company. At the time, they were doing Apocalypse Now and The Black Stallion. I actually got started on Apocalypse through a synthesist named Bernie Krause, who was hired to work on that score, and I had done work with him as an orchestrator and arranger in his commercial products. So he called me in, and we had a sort of a trial period of 2 months where Bernie and Francis and Richard Beggs and I were taking scenes from Apocalypse and trying out this idea that Francis wanted to have a synthetic orchestra. He wanted to carry over this idea of technology and technology sort of overwhelming human compassion. And he thought that the synthesizer was the perfect instrument to be a voice for that in the musical score for Apocalypse. I spent 6 months on that movie. The first 2 months, as I said, were kind of experimenting with how we would get this to happen. How could you get monophonic synthesizers before MIDI to come together and sound like an orchestra? I played a conductor track that all of the synthesis would fit their performance to, which was the way we synchronized the music to the film. So they had a piano performance that I would create under Francis's direction. So Carmine would write the music. Francis would come in and say, Dad, that's too long there. Can't you, Shirley, why don't you just take some of the measures out and just let me hear it, play it on the piano like that, So it was wonderful for me to see how a director thought about his own scene and how the music would work with that. I followed Apocalypse Now with the Black Stallion. Carol Ballard was interested in doing that same kind of thing, having some creative musical person improvise to the film under his guidance, just, I guess, like he would work with actors, perhaps. I was very comfortable being in a support role to Carmine Coppola first on Apocalypse Now and The Black Stallion. And during the course of Black Stallion, I met Dan Carlin Jr., who was second generation industry, said, you know, Shirley, there's people in Los Angeles that do this all the time, that write music for movies. You really should come down and see if you could fit there. I had some wonderful years conducting and orchestrating for Danny Elfman, Hans Zimmer, Carter Burwell, Brad Fiedel. It was wonderful. And then I gradually became more and more interested in having my own opportunities, and increasingly I got to have those opportunities. The first theatrical film score that I got to do, I was terrified. It's the type of movie I call a vanity movie, where an aspiring actress had gotten her family money involved in producing a film that she starred in. The End of August, I guess, ended up being the final title. And that was the first time when it was going to have my name on it. And I was terrified. I thought, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how do you know where to put the music, But I did what everybody else does. You just call everybody you know and ask questions. And it was a period piece, and it needed a light kind of French impressionism. And I was delighted to get to do something like that, because it wasn't a very commercial Hollywood sound. It was a little more unique than that. It probably wasn't commercial enough, but, you think about that when you're young, certainly. one of my regrets about the industry in this time is that there isn't a sufficient training ground in orchestral music for people who aspire to be film composers. A lot of people walk into town and they are instantly working on an A-list film, and they're out there right, you know, on their own pretty much with all that responsibility and weight. And it can be a very wasteful process, frankly. I think the musicians union tends to be blamed. Oh, those musicians cost so much. But in fact, there's nothing worse than knowing that the composer has not written more than 2 minutes of music and the orchestra has been hired and is going to be paid for 6 hours to be there, and there just isn't any more than 2 minutes of music to record. If the composer's unwilling to divulge that to anybody on the film, then they come in and they're watching and what's taking this orchestra so long to record this music? Well, the composer's taking all day because he knows he hasn't written anything else. And you can't, as the part of the team that knows that, you can't go, oh, well, didn't you know he didn't write any more than 2 minutes of music, you know? So there's all kinds of wonderfully silly things like that that contribute to the difficulty of scoring music for film. That is not scored. One of the best surprises in this movie is the death of the character that gets hit by the bus. It comes so out of left field. You are so totally not expecting it. And that's, again, how we used music to set that up. Up till that point in time, music was the big pointing finger that says something's going to happen, something's going to happen. And then we just withheld it so that you're just sitting there not thinking, well, nothing's going to happen. There's no scary music here. And then wham! Surprise! I really had long periods of time between my opportunities to compose my own film scores. And I really utilized that time by orchestrating and conducting for other film composers who had established gravy train type careers. And that was a wonderful learning experience too for me. I got to witness firsthand the dynamic involved in working with problem directors and the dynamics of how you work with the studio, and the people who are paying for it have to be considered at every step of the way. It allowed me to experiment with some of my own ideas about orchestration on again, without me being under the gun. The the Final Destination score was fun in the way I was able to combine the synths and the orchestra too. I did all the synths as pre-records in my own studio, even creating this sort of death whisper that's going like that, that's just subliminally there in some of the sounds. And it's real fun to have just that palette of sheer atmospheric, almost sound, but musical in nature elements that are part of the score that then overlap and are intertwined and, mixed in and out with the instruments. The synths are used very subtly in this score. You hardly realize they're there. If you listen to the music alone, of course, it's obvious you can hear them. They provide atmosphere in some of the starts of the suspense sequences where to use the instruments would be too heavy of a sound, I think, too heavy of a musical presence. So it starts some of the death sequences where it's just real spooky at first, but we're not even sure that there's music there. That's more the nature that I use the synths. And hers is the most prolonged, the goriest, and was, again, real fun. It was just a very prolonged suspense. As the audience, we hear that low piano and timpanis going, and we go, "Oh no, she's in for it now. She's in trouble." The Mrs. Luton death scene is an example for me of where the temp music was so great and fitting that I just couldn't come up with anything better. And I did something that's mimicking almost to the point of embarrassment for me what that temp score was. I don't know the piece. It was probably a Chris Young piece. I'll have to ask Tom, who wrote the piece that they used in there. And I wrote something that, was different than that, but still carried, I felt, the kind of energy that the temp did. But boy, we got to where we were playing it, and I listened, and I thought, this just isn't even anywhere near the ferocity that temp piece had. And I knew it had a string figure where the strings went, in these ever-climbing intervals. And mine was like a much more rigid thing that was just like these gnarly, dissonant chords that were just going da 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 da. So it had a lot of force and everything, but it wasn't as freaked out as the temp piece was. So I just stood there on the podium. I thought, oh shoot, professional embarrassment aside, I gotta do something that's gonna, just fly off to hell like that temp music does. And I just called it from the podium. I just said, okay, forget the ink. Here's what we're gonna do. You take those clusters that are on your paper, instead of the written rhythm, do a swooping motion, and I just kind of sang the riff for them. And that's another great thing about LA musicians. They're not terrified when you do that. You stand there on the podium, you just make it up, and they scribble a little bit on the music, and off you go. The first preview generally has a temp score with it. I know when Danny Elfman did Edward Scissorhands, which I had the pleasure to conduct, Tim Burton was adamant that the film not be screened without the actual score because he felt it helped carry the structure of the film so well and the pacing that there was no way he was going to let any audience see that movie with a temp score. Our film, Final Destination, once the mock-up for the main title was done, they immediately put that in the movie because they loved it so much. So that was one piece of even in a mock-up version of the score that went right in. I think the whole preview process has had an interesting evolution. I think in the beginning, filmmakers used it as a legitimate way for themselves to secretly make up their mind about how they were going to get an audience to react the way they wanted them to. By this point in time, it's been totally co-opted by marketing. And the preview process is completely idiotic to me. It's incomprehensible to me that a group of strangers that know all about movie previews by now would be allowed to make important decisions about what kind of an ending a movie should have on it. But that's how movies are made these days. I think that when business and marketing and salespeople make decisions about movies, you're going to have more pop songs in them. I think not all filmmakers are interested in doing that for their films, and it's a real tension. I've heard, a music supervisor tell a group of young and upcoming directors at Sundance, you don't want to be known in the business as a director who's unwilling to be flexible about your use of music, which I found pretty horrifying, but actually very real. Again, we're in a period here where a sales dynamic is making decisions about filmmaking rather than filmmakers. I don't have an opinion about whether it benefits or hurts. It certainly sells records, and sometimes the records sell the movie. There's less room for score when there's songs, so certainly there's an impact there for me as a background film composer. I just think it's hard for filmmakers to stand up to an industry that has a sales dynamic so prevalent in the decision making about product right now. It's as if in the car industry, the people who sold the cars were telling the engineers how to make a car. Like that engine should have 20 cylinders because people like cylinders, It kind of doesn't make sense to me, but I think it's a reality of the way business is done right now in the industry. The actual orchestra size for Final Destination was on the small side as movie orchestras go. They're way over 100 most of the time these days. But we were down in the 70s and low 80s, which was, very comfortable. I think one of the things I enjoy so much about recording in Los Angeles is the sheer quality and the depth of bass of the musicians available. As I'm writing, I tend to write for orchestra because that's in my nature, it's in my background, it's in my training. So I'm hearing whether it's going to be the strings or the brass or the woodwinds or whatever. The finished orchestration, of course, is the ultimate detail set out of all of that. And then that list goes to a music contractor. And we may have a conversation about players, like who would you like for your concertmaster? and the principal section leaders and that kind of thing. I've worked enough in the town now that the contractors I work with have my list. They know who I like to work with. And if we need to, we talk about new players that maybe I haven't had a chance to work with before. Yeah, the scene where the students now are trying to escape not only death but the FBI really really wanted to have that break out and be away from what everything else in the score was. So for the first time, I'm using electronic percussion. It has more of a contemporary feel to it. And then right in this, they have this one conversation in the middle of the cue where that death idea comes back in the music, and then bam, we're right back to the drums and the, just scariness of him driving recklessly. This cue is an example of the type of cue that you have to write even when, again, sound effects is going to be the most important thing driving this scene. All the screeching tires, brakes, and, squealing around corners and stuff is really what carries the excitement of this. But the music still has to be there, giving it some presence. I think the relationship between music and sound is pretty frustrating for any composer right now, because we're in a period of where stylistically sound is huge and dense and overblown, just like, for many, many years, music was huge, dense, and overblown, and that's all you heard was either dialogue or music. And now we're way over here somewhere where we still have music there, but sound is just huge. I mean, it's laughable to me when you go see a movie where every time there's an engine of any kind, a motorcycle, a car, or whatever, it's like this deep, throaty roaring, there's almost like a jet motor in there. It's just real exaggerated right now. I thought Contact was a breath of fresh air, the way Bob Zemeckis used silence in that movie. It was just really, the sound work was so controlled in there. It was fantastic. But music isn't the only thing that makes a movie work. I'm always real conscious of not doing the same thing in the same situation. I think that's important to keep an audience from guessing. If you just treat every similar circumstance the same, then it gets boring for them too. I think the Billy's death of the decapitation, we made the decision by that point not to have score addressing it. I think by the end of the film, we have 8 minutes straight that has music in it, leading up. It's that whole final chase where Alex runs out of the cabin, knowing that Claire is going to be attacked by Death next, and is hoping to save her. Once Claire decides that she's going to tell the FBI where Alex is, and we then see Alex running from the cabin to come to her, that's when the final arc of action begins. And from that point until the moment when Alex is kind of blown up, that's one great big long piece of music, which of course we recorded in several sections. I don't have any need to put the orchestra through what would be like a concert performance. I know some composers feel very strongly that if it's an 8-minute musical arc, that it should be an 8-minute musical performance. It wasn't practical in our conditions in this film. And I knew that in an action setting where we would have a lot of ferocity in the playing, especially for the brass, by breaking it up, you just give them the opportunity to get blood back in their lips so that they can continue to play. I don't think a lot of composers understand that, like the string basses, when they're playing, their left hand is up in the air. And if you have them holding a low note on the instrument, which is where their hand is elevated the highest, and they have to do that for 2 minutes, the blood runs out of their hand, and they get so their fingers can't hold the string in place. Simple stuff like that. If people thought about that a little bit more, they wouldn't, think it wasn't so important to have something where the basses are holding the low C for 5 minutes. I think we broke the last 8-minute segment up into 3 cues that were all pretty long, but doable. I mean, 3 to 4 minutes is doable by a Hollywood orchestra, even if it's ferocious stuff. They're used to that, and they can sit and do it 6 hours a day, which is mind-boggling. Many of the new players that come into town year after year that come from, Boston Symphony or someplace like that, they're totally unprepared for having to sit and play for 6 hours straight. Well, I mean, with a meal break, of course, but to play, ferocious stuff that requires real chops and just over and over and over again. Relentless. The thing that I tell composers who come to me for mentoring or to talk or whatever, I feel it's very important to be a good business person. You don't have a chance if you're only a creative being. If you come in at the top of the business because you've succeeded somewhere else, you're going to be fine because the business is lusting after you because of something else you've done. So even if you don't know how to compose background music for films, you're going to be fine because you will hire the people who know how to help you do that. I think it's hardest for musical people who maybe have come out of Berklee School of Music or someplace like that and feel they want to be a film composer because they're years away from getting to really do the work. And it's hard to comprehend how many years you have to spend setting up your opportunities. So you've got to really hang in there. It takes a lot of persistence and patience and relationship building in order to get to have that dream that you've got. Being reality-based, I think if Jim and Glenn have coattails, then I will get to do more films. I have not worked on products that are so successful that the industry has a perception of me as having that allure. If I had worked on films that had done gazillions of box office, then it doesn't kind of matter what my music is because I'm associated with that success. I feel I have a relatively successful kind of mid-level career as a composer, and that's the reality of the middle of the business. It's whoever wants to hire you that you have that kind of relationship with. If they succeed, then I get to succeed. By the time we're out almost to the end and we see that Alex has in fact not died and that he and his two remaining friends are in Paris, the score gets to just let that be on its own. And the John Denver song triggers our knowing that, it's not over yet. Something else is going to happen. And then as Alex becomes aware, that they're yet again in trouble, the score kicks in again and has, just those same familiar techniques that we've become used to throughout the movie. The death tune comes back in one more time. And we end with a blast of cacophony before the final death. The end of the movie is a great joke. It's almost like a Shaggy Dog story, and you go, oh, gosh. So you have to leave room for that. Music has got to stay out of the way when you've got comedy like that involved.